As we struggle every day with the computers, we begin to feel the immediate need for a little Zen philosophy or something of that nature to keep us in one piece. And I think that the most interesting ancient approach to the whole problem of modern intellectualism is that of Buddhism, which in turn derived most of its fundamentals from Hinduism. In the Hindu classics, there is the simple line, "The mind is the slayer of the real." And through thousands of years of human experience, this has been more or less proven to be true. The mind is something that we do not understand, for there is no way apparently that we can grasp its proportions except by its own use. And it is a little bit like a dictator who gradually takes on control and command of every part of man's instruments of knowledge and growth. The mind must be considered, therefore, as a kind of machine. And Buddha called it the machine of the six sensory perceptions. Now, at his time, machinery must have been pretty primitive, but he still used this term, and he used it in a way that was quite authoritative. He meant definitely that the mind was an instrument. The mind is not the self. The mind does not speak for the self. The mind does not make infallible utterances. The mind is bound to a series of mechanical processes rather parallel to those of a computer. The mind has to take in certain information. This information is then classified and organized, and certain conclusions arise as to the relative values of the various fragments of understanding or experience or evidence that we find. There is no point, apparently, in the mental instrument in which it can transcend itself. Now, it is certainly true that if you buy a cheap computer, you're not going to get much. And if you live through life with a cheap mind, you're not going to do much better. Fortunately, however, we can gain certain mental maturities. We can become a little more wise in thinking. We can discipline the machine. Just as the operator of a computer has to know what he's doing, has to study the problems of his instrument, or else get into serious difficulties, so the same is true of the mind. We take it for granted, but it is not something that can safely be taken for granted. The mind is an instrument that has to be observed, that has to be worked with, that has to be enlightened as far as possible, and must be always under the discipline of something superior to itself. There must be the operator, not only for the computer but for the mind. And this is part of the oldest form of Indian philosophy, that there has to be something above the phenomenal existence to help us to create a way of life that can escape from mediocrity. That we do not need to go on through life learning little, suffering much, and actually passing out of this environment very little ahead of what we were when we came in. Experience is important, but only if we understand it. All kinds of living gives us information if we know how to gather that information. We read books. Maybe they help, but without discrimination, reading can be a total loss. We go and travel to different parts of the world, and through the sensory perceptions we observe where we've been. But we can go completely around the world and come home without any basic understanding of humanity. All these problems go back to the machine of the sensory perceptions. And the principal perceptions, according to Buddhism, are five. what we call the five senses. And these are the gateways by means of which information goes in to the computer. These five channels, therefore, are constantly affecting each other and together affecting the conduct of the person to whom they belong.